Michael Hayes stood at the edge of the dusty road, his eyes scanning the horizon. The Afghan sun beat down mercilessly, but he barely noticed the heat anymore. Beside him, alert and ready, sat Billy, his loyal Belgian Malinois. The dog's ears twitched at every sound, his dark eyes focused on the path ahead. This was their routine, a dance they had perfected over countless missions. As Michael adjusted his grip on his rifle, his mind wandered to how he'd ended up here, in this sun-baked corner of the world, with a dog as his closest companion. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, he'd always dreamed of serving his country. The military had seemed like the perfect fit for a kid who craved structure and purpose. What he hadn't expected was how much of that purpose he'd find in a four-legged partner. Billy had come into Michael's life during his second tour. At first, Michael had been skeptical. Sure, he liked dogs well enough, but how much help could one really be in a war zone? It didn't take long for Billy to prove him wrong. The dog's keen senses had saved their unit more times than Michael could count, sniffing out hidden explosives and warning of approaching danger before any human could detect it. But it wasn't just Billy's skills that had won Michael over. It was the unwavering loyalty, the silent understanding that passed between them. In the quieter moments, when the weight of their responsibilities threatened to overwhelm him, Billy would nudge Michael's hand with his nose, as if to say, "I'm here. We've got this." Their bond had been forged in the crucible of combat, tested and strengthened with each passing day. Michael found himself talking to Billy during long nights on watch, sharing his fears and hopes in a way he never could with his human comrades. The dog listened without judgment, his steady presence a balm for Michael's frayed nerves. "You know, buddy," Michael murmured, reaching down to scratch behind Billy's ears, "I don't think I could do this without you." Billy's tail thumped against the ground, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. As they continued their patrol, Michael's thoughts drifted to home. He wondered what his mom, Sarah, was doing right now. Probably tending to her garden, he mused. The image of her kneeling in the rich Ohio soil, coaxing life from the earth, seemed a world away from the barren landscape surrounding him. Sarah had been worried when Michael told her about his new canine partner. "Just be careful," she'd said during one of their infrequent phone calls. "Don't get too attached. Remember, he's a working dog, not a pet." But Michael knew it was too late for that warning. Billy was far more than just a tool of war. He was a friend, a confidant, a brother in arms. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Michael and Billy made their way back to base. The evening air brought a slight chill, a welcome relief after the day's heat. The sounds of the camp grew louder as they approached, voices calling out, the clang of mess tins, the low hum of generators. In the chow line, Michael felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see his buddy, Jake, grinning at him. "How's it going, dog whisperer?" Jake teased, nodding towards Billy who sat patiently at Michael's feet. Michael rolled his eyes, but he couldn't help smiling. "Just another day in paradise," he quipped. As they filled their trays with the night's offerings, some kind of meat in brown sauce, instant mashed potatoes, and overcooked vegetables, Michael found himself grateful for these moments of normalcy, of camaraderie. Later, in the quiet of his bunk, Michael pulled out a worn notebook. He'd started journaling early in his first tour, finding that putting his thoughts on paper helped him process the chaos around him. Tonight, he wrote about Billy, about the way the dog seemed to sense his moods, always knowing when to offer comfort and when to give space. "I never thought I'd say this," he wrote, "but I think this dog understands me better than anyone else here. Maybe better than anyone back home, too. Is that crazy?" As he penned the words, Michael felt a weight lift from his shoulders. There was something freeing about admitting the depth of his bond with Billy, even if it was just to himself. He glanced over at the dog, curled up on his bed nearby. In the dim light, he could see Billy's chest rising and falling with each breath, a steady rhythm that Michael found comforting. The next few weeks passed in a blur of patrols, training exercises, and tense moments. Each day seemed to bring new challenges, new threats to navigate. But through it all, Michael and Billy worked as one, their partnership growing stronger with each shared experience. There was the time they'd been caught in a sudden sandstorm, visibility dropping to near zero in a matter of minutes. Michael had felt panic rising in his chest, the disorientation threatening to overwhelm him. But then he'd felt Billy press against his leg, guiding him back to safety. The dog's internal compass had proven more reliable than any piece of equipment. And then there was the day they'd stumbled upon an abandoned village, the eerie silence broken only by the wind whistling through empty doorways. As they'd searched the buildings, Billy's sudden growl had alerted Michael to a hidden cache of weapons. Who knew what tragedy they'd prevented that day? But it wasn't all high-stakes drama. There were quieter moments too, moments that Michael treasured just as much. Like the evening Billy had somehow managed to snag an entire chicken from the mess tent, leading half the camp on a merry chase before finally being cornered by a laughing Michael. Or the time they'd found a group of local children playing soccer with a makeshift ball, and Billy had joined in, much to the kids' delight. As his tour neared its end, Michael found himself increasingly torn. Part of him yearned for home, for the familiar comforts of civilian life. But another part dreaded leaving Billy behind. He knew the dog would be assigned to another handler, would continue his important work. But the thought of saying goodbye felt like a physical ache in his chest. "I wish I could take you with me, boy," Michael murmured one night, his fingers buried in Billy's fur. The dog looked up at him with those soulful eyes, and Michael could have sworn he understood every word. The day of Michael's departure dawned clear and bright. As he shouldered his pack, he knelt down next to Billy one last time. "You take care of yourself, all right?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And take care of the next guy too. But don't forget about me." Billy pressed his nose against Michael's cheek, his tail wagging slowly. It wasn't goodbye, not really. They both knew their bond went deeper than distance or time could touch. As the transport plane lifted off, carrying Michael back to American soil, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The memories of his time with Billy played through his mind like a movie, the good, the bad, the terrifying, and the beautiful. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Michael knew he was stronger for having had Billy by his side. Little did he know, as the Afghan landscape faded beneath him, that his journey with Billy was far from over. The true test of their bond, and the impact it would have on countless lives, was just beginning. The morning of Michael Hayes' funeral dawned grey and somber, as if the sky itself was in mourning. A chill wind whispered through the trees of Oak Hill Cemetery, causing the autumn leaves to rustle in a melancholy chorus. In the Hayes family home, just a few miles away, Sarah stood before the mirror, her trembling hands struggling with the buttons of her black blouse. "Oh, Michael," she whispered, her voice catching on a sob. "How did we end up here?" It had been just over a week since the accident. Sarah could still hear the knock on the door, still see the solemn faces of the officers who had come to deliver the news. Michael, her brave, kind-hearted boy, gone in an instant. A drunk driver, a slick road, a moment's inattention, and suddenly, the world had tilted on its axis. As Sarah made her way downstairs, her eyes fell on the collection of photos lining the wall. Michael as a grinning toddler, covered in mud from head to toe. Michael on his first day of high school, trying to look cool but unable to hide his excitement. And there, pride of place, Michael in his uniform, standing tall and proud with Billy by his side. Billy. The thought of the dog sent a fresh wave of pain through Sarah's heart. Since Michael's death, Billy had been listless, barely eating, spending most of his time lying by the door as if waiting for his master to return. When Sarah had brought him home after Michael's last deployment, she'd been amazed at the change in her son. The haunted look in his eyes had softened, his nightmares had become less frequent. "Mom," Michael had told her, his arm draped over Billy's shoulders, "this dog saved my life over there. And he's saving it all over again now." A soft whine drew Sarah's attention to the present. Billy stood at the foot of the stairs, his brown eyes fixed on her with an almost human-like sadness. "Oh, sweetheart," Sarah murmured, kneeling down to scratch behind his ears. "I know. I miss him too." The drive to the cemetery was silent, save for Billy's occasional whimper from the back seat. Sarah's brother, Tom, was at the wheel, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. They passed familiar landmarks, the high school where Michael had played football, the park where he'd learned to ride a bike, the recruitment office where he'd signed up for the military, full of youthful idealism and determination to make a difference. As they pulled into the cemetery, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The place was already crowded with people, fellow soldiers in crisp dress uniforms, old-school friends in dark suits, neighbors and community members who had known Michael since he was a boy. And there, gleaming in the weak sunlight, was the flag-draped casket. "I don't know if I can do this, Tom," Sarah whispered, her hand frozen on the door handle. Her brother reached over, squeezing her hand gently. "You can," he said softly. "Michael would be so proud of you. And you're not alone. We're all here with you." As Sarah stepped out of the car, Billy close at her heels, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. She could feel their eyes on her, could almost hear their unspoken condolences. But it was Billy who drew the most attention. The dog's presence seemed to underscore the reality of the situation in a way that even the casket couldn't. This wasn't just a soldier being laid to rest, this was a friend, a son, a partner. The ceremony began, the chaplain's words washing over Sarah in a blur of platitudes and scripture. She found herself focusing instead on the faces around her. There was Jake, Michael's buddy from his unit, his jaw clenched tight as he fought back tears. And there was Ms. Rodriguez, Michael's high school English teacher, who had encouraged his love of writing and had been thrilled when he'd started keeping a journal during his deployment. As the honor guard began the formal presentation of the flag, Sarah felt a warmth against her leg. Billy had pressed himself close, his eyes never leaving the casket. When the first notes of taps rang out, the dog's ears pricked up, his head tilting as if listening for a familiar voice. It was then that it happened. As the bugler reached the final, haunting notes of the song, Billy let out a howl. It wasn't the bark of an excited dog or the whine of a pet seeking attention. It was a mournful, heart-wrenching sound that seemed to carry all the grief and loss that words couldn't express. The sound cut through the ceremony like a knife, causing more than a few attendees to break down in tears. Sarah knelt down, wrapping her arms around Billy's neck as her own tears fell freely. In that moment, the divide between human and animal grief seemed to dissolve. They were united in their loss, in their love for Michael. As the ceremony drew to a close and people began to disperse, many paused to offer their condolences to Sarah. But just as many stopped to pat Billy, to offer a kind word or a treat to the dog who had so clearly lost his best friend. A gruff voice said, and Sarah looked up to see an older man in a veteran's cap standing before her. "I served with dogs in Vietnam. Never seen a bond like your son had with this one. That dog there, he's a hero too." Sarah managed a watery smile, her hand still stroking Billy's fur. "Thank you," she said softly. Michael always said Billy was the best partner he could have asked for. As the crowd thinned out, Sarah found herself unable to leave. She stood there, Billy by her side, staring at the casket that held her son. The enormity of it all threatened to overwhelm her. How was she supposed to go on? How could the world keep turning when Michael was gone? It was Billy who finally broke her reverie. The dog gently tugged at her sleeve, then looked towards the cemetery gates. It was time to go home. The days that followed passed in a blur. Sarah went through the motions of living, answering calls, accepting casseroles from well-meaning neighbors, sorting through Michael's things. But it all felt hollow, meaningless. The only thing that seemed real was Billy's constant presence. The dog followed her from room to room, always close, always watching with those understanding eyes. One evening, about a week after the funeral, Sarah found herself in Michael's room. She hadn't been able to bring herself to change anything yet. His clothes still hung in the closet, his books still lined the shelves. On the bedside table, she spotted his journal, the one he'd kept during his last deployment. With trembling hands, Sarah picked up the book. She knew she shouldn't read it, it felt like an invasion of privacy. But she needed to feel close to her son, needed to hear his voice again, even if only in her head. As she opened the journal, a photo slipped out. It showed Michael and Billy, sitting together in the Afghan sun. Michael was grinning, his arm around the dog, looking happier and more at peace than Sarah had seen him in years. On the back, in Michael's messy scrawl, was written, "Me and my brother in arms. Don't know what I'd do without him." Sarah sank onto the bed, the journal clutched to her chest, as a fresh wave of grief washed over her. She felt the mattress dip as Billy jumped up beside her, resting his head on her lap. Together, woman and dog sat in the fading light, united in their love for the man they had lost. As night fell, Sarah began to read. Michael's words painted a vivid picture of his life overseas, the challenges, the fears, the moments of unexpected beauty. But more than anything, they spoke of his relationship with Billy. Page after page was filled with anecdotes about the dog's bravery, his intelligence, his unwavering loyalty. "Billy isn't just a dog," one entry read. "He's a soldier, a friend, a lifeline. I don't think anyone back home can really understand what he means to me. How do you explain that your best friend, the one who knows you better than anyone else in the world, has 4 legs and a tail?" As Sarah read, something began to stir within her. A sense of purpose, small but growing stronger with each page. Michael was gone, yes. But his story, and Billy's, didn't have to end here. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to honor her son's memory and help others in the process. With Billy still by her side, Sarah reached for a notepad and began to write. Ideas flowed from her pen: a foundation to support veterans and their service dogs, programs to help soldiers transition back to civilian life, education initiatives to teach people about the vital role these animals play both in combat and at home. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, Sarah looked down at the pages of notes she'd written. For the first time since Michael's death, she felt a glimmer of hope. She couldn't bring her son back, but she could make sure his legacy lived on. She turned to Billy, who was watching her with those soulful eyes. "What do you think, boy?" she asked softly. "Ready for a new mission?" Billy's tail thumped against the bed, and Sarah could have sworn she saw a spark of the old energy in his eyes. Together, they would find a way forward. Together, they would make sure Michael's story, and the stories of countless other soldiers and their canine companions, would be heard. As the new day dawned, Sarah and Billy made their way downstairs. There was work to be done, a legacy to build. And though the road ahead would be long and often difficult, they would walk it together, guided by the memory of the man they both loved. The weeks following Michael's funeral stretched into months, each day a struggle for Sarah to find a new normal. The house, once filled with Michael's laughter and energy, now felt cavernous and empty. Every corner held a memory, every object a reminder of the son she had lost. Sarah found herself wandering from room to room, touching Michael's things as if they could somehow bring him back. His favorite coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter, unwashed since the last time he'd used it. His jacket hung by the door, as if waiting for him to grab it on his way out. These small, everyday items now felt like precious relics, tangible links to a life cut short. Billy, too, seemed lost in the emptiness. The once vibrant and energetic dog now moved through the house like a ghost, his usual spark dimmed by grief. He spent hours lying in Michael's room, his nose pressed against the worn combat boots that still held a trace of his master's scent. Sarah often found him there, curled up on the bed, his eyes fixed on the door as if expecting Michael to walk in at any moment. "Oh, Billy," Sarah would murmur, sitting beside him and running her fingers through his fur. "I miss him too, boy. I miss him so much." In those quiet moments, Sarah found herself talking to Billy as if he could understand every word. She told him stories about Michael as a child, about his dreams and fears, about the man he had become. And in a way, Billy did understand. His warm brown eyes would meet hers, filled with a depth of emotion that needed no words. As the days passed, Sarah noticed that Billy's behavior was changing. He refused to eat from his usual bowl, instead waiting patiently by Michael's empty chair at the dinner table. His favorite toys lay untouched in the corner, gathering dust. Even his once keen senses seemed dulled, the mailman's approach no longer elicited even a half-hearted bark. Worried, Sarah took Billy to the local vet, Dr. Anderson, an old family friend who had known Michael since he was a boy. "Physically, he's fine," Dr. Anderson said after a thorough examination. "But animals can experience grief just like humans do. Billy's lost his partner, his purpose. It's going to take time for him to adjust." The vet's words struck a chord with Sarah. Wasn't that exactly how she felt? Lost, purposeless, struggling to find her footing in a world that no longer made sense. On the drive home, Sarah glanced at Billy in the rearview mirror. The dog sat quietly in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. She remembered how excited he used to get for car rides, his tail wagging furiously, head out the window to catch the breeze. Now, He seemed almost indifferent to the experience. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" Sarah said softly. "Both of us trying to figure out how to live in a world without Michael." As if in response, Billy let out a small whine. Back at home, Sarah found herself drawn once again to Michael's room. She stood in the doorway, taking in the familiar sights, the faded posters on the walls, the bookshelf crammed with well-worn paperbacks, the desk where Michael had spent hours writing in his journal. The journal. Sarah's eyes fell on the leather-bound book sitting on the nightstand. She had read parts of it in the days following the funeral, finding comfort in Michael's words. Now, she picked it up again, running her fingers over the cover before opening it to a random page. "Billy did something amazing today," Michael had written. "We were on patrol, and he suddenly stopped, refusing to move forward. Turns out there was an IED buried in the road ahead. If it wasn't for him, who knows what could have happened. I keep telling the guys, Billy's not just a dog, he's the best soldier in our unit." Sarah smiled through her tears, remembering how proud Michael had been of Billy's abilities. She flipped through more pages, each entry painting a vivid picture of the bond between soldier and dog. "Sometimes I think Billy understands me better than anyone else here," one passage read. "When the nightmares get bad, he's always there, nudging me awake, staying close until the shaking stops. I don't know how I'll readjust to civilian life without him." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Michael had been planning to adopt Billy after his service was over. They were supposed to have a life together, to help each other heal from the traumas of war. Instead, Billy had come home alone, thrust into a world he didn't understand, without the one person who truly knew him. In that moment, something shifted in Sarah. The fog of grief that had surrounded her for months began to lift, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. She couldn't bring Michael back, but she could honor his memory by taking care of Billy, by helping him find his place in this new reality. With renewed determination, Sarah began to make changes. She moved Billy's bed into Michael's room, surrounding him with familiar scents and memories. She dug out the training manual Michael had used, spending hours each day working with Billy, giving him the structure and purpose he craved. Slowly but surely, signs of the old Billy began to emerge. His ears would perk up at the sound of Sarah's voice, his tail giving a tentative wag. He started to show interest in his toys again, particularly the worn tennis ball that had been Michael's favorite for playing fetch. One sunny afternoon, as Sarah sat on the back porch reading Michael's journal, she had an idea. "Hey Billy," she called, "want to go for a walk?" To her surprise and delight, Billy trotted over, his tail swaying gently. It wasn't the enthusiastic response he once would have given, but it was progress. They made their way to the local park, the same one where Michael had taught Billy to catch a frisbee during his last leave. As they walked, Sarah found herself talking to Billy, sharing memories of those happier times. "Remember how Michael would always let you win at tug-of-war," she said with a chuckle. "He said it was good for your confidence, but I think he just couldn't stand to see you disappointed." At the sound of Michael's name, Billy's ears pricked up. He looked at Sarah, his head tilted in that quizzical way that always reminded her of Michael. Encouraged, Sarah continued to talk, telling Billy stories about Michael's childhood, his dreams for the future, the impact he had made on everyone around him. As she spoke, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time since the funeral, she was able to think about Michael without being overwhelmed by grief. As they made their way home, Sarah's mind was racing with ideas. She thought about all the other veterans out there, struggling to readjust to civilian life. How many of them had partners like Billy? How many could benefit from the unique bond between soldier and service dog? That night, as Billy curled up on Michael's bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by notes and printouts. She had spent hours researching veteran support programs, animal-assisted therapy, and organizations that trained service dogs for military personnel. "What do you think, Billy?" she asked, looking over at the dog. "Should we do this? Should we try to help other people like Michael?" Billy raised his head, his eyes meeting Sarah's. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw a spark of the old Billy, the loyal partner who had stood by Michael's side through thick and thin. Taking a deep breath, Sarah picked up her phone and dialed a number she had found during her research. "Hello," she said when someone answered, My name is Sarah Hayes. My son was a soldier who worked with a military dog. I think I have an idea for a program that could help other veterans and their canine partners. Would you be willing to listen?" As Sarah began to outline her ideas, she felt a sense of hope that had been missing for months. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time since losing Michael, she felt like she had a purpose again. And as she talked, Billy padded over and rested his head on her lap, his warmth a comforting presence. Together, they would find a way to fill the empty spaces left by Michael's absence. Together, they would ensure that his legacy and the powerful bond he had shared with Billy would live on. The empty spaces in their lives would never truly be filled, but perhaps they could be transformed into something meaningful, something that would honor Michael's memory and help others in the process. As Sarah hung up the phone, feeling a glimmer of excitement for the first time in months, she looked down at Billy. "Well, boy," she said softly, scratching behind his ears, "looks like we've got work to do. You ready for a new mission?" Billy's tail thumped against the floor, a sound that filled the quiet house with a promise of hope and new beginnings. The empty spaces were still there, but now they held the possibility of something new, a chance to make a difference, to keep Michael's spirit alive in the best way they knew how. As Sarah and Billy settled in for the night, the house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. It was filled with memories, yes, but also with the potential for a future neither of them had imagined. A future where the bond between soldiers and their canine companions could help heal the wounds of war and bring hope to those who needed it most. The warm glow of the computer screen illuminated Sarah's face as she pored over yet another website. It was well past midnight, but sleep had become a distant memory in recent weeks. Ever since that phone call, Sarah had thrown herself into research with a fervor that surprised even her. Every free moment was spent learning about veteran support programs, service dog training, and the challenges faced by soldiers returning from combat. Billy lay at her feet, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the quiet house. Occasionally, Sarah would reach down to scratch behind his ears, drawing strength from his presence. "We're going to do this, boy," she murmured. "For Michael. For all of them." As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Sarah sat back, rubbing her tired eyes. Her notebook was filled with scribbled ideas, contact information, and half-formed plans. It was overwhelming, but for the first time in months, she felt a sense of purpose. Later that morning, Sarah found herself sitting across from Tom Wilson, a local veteran who had served with Michael during his first tour. They were at Rose's Diner, a favorite hangout for many of the town's former military personnel. "I gotta say, Sarah," Tom said, stirring his coffee, "when you called, I wasn't sure what to expect. But this idea of yours, it's got potential." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I know it's ambitious, but I really think we could make a difference. These dogs, they're not just pets. They're partners, lifelines." Michael's journal, the way he wrote about Billy, it made me realize how important that bond is. Tom nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've seen it firsthand. Guys who came back all closed off, barely talking. Get them with one of these dogs, and it's like a switch flips. They start opening up, dealing with stuff they've been bottling up for years." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their food. As Sarah picked at her omelette, she couldn't help but notice the way Tom's eyes kept drifting to Billy, who was lying quietly under the table. "You know," Tom said suddenly, "I've got some buddies who might be interested in helping out. Guys who've been there, who know what it's like. Could be good for them too, having a project to focus on." Sarah felt a surge of hope. "That would be amazing, Tom. I've got some ideas, but I could really use input from people who've been through it." As they continued to talk, their plans began to take shape. Tom suggested reaching out to local businesses for support, while Sarah thought about contacting Michael's old unit to spread the word. By the time they left the diner, they had the beginnings of a real strategy. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's living room became command central for their fledgling organization. Maps, charts, and to-do lists covered every available surface. Billy seemed to sense the change in the air, his demeanor becoming more alert and engaged with each passing day. One sunny afternoon, as Sarah was on the phone with a potential donor, she heard a commotion outside. Excusing herself, she went to investigate, only to find Billy in the backyard, tail wagging as he played tug-of-war with a piece of rope. Her neighbor's son, a shy boy named Kyle, was on the other end, laughing as Billy playfully growled. Sarah watched, tears pricking her eyes. It was the first time since Michael's death that she'd seen Billy truly play. As Kyle's mother came over to apologize for the intrusion, Sarah had an idea. Actually, she said, would Kyle like to come over more often to play with Billy? I think it would be good for both of them. This simple interaction sparked a new dimension to Sarah's project. She realized that the benefits of these service dogs could extend beyond the veterans themselves, touching entire communities. With renewed energy, Sarah threw herself into organizing their first event, a small gathering in the local community center to introduce their idea to the public. She spent hours preparing her speech, practicing in front of Billy until she had every word just right. The day of the event arrived, bringing with it a mix of excitement and nerves. As Sarah stood at the podium, Billy a reassuring presence by her side, she looked out at the faces of friends, neighbors, and strangers who had come to listen. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Many of you knew my son, Michael. He was a soldier, a son, a friend. And he was also the partner of this amazing dog, Billy." As Sarah spoke about Michael's experiences, about the vital role Billy had played both on the battlefield and at home, she could see people leaning forward, engaged by her words. She shared stories from Michael's journal, bringing to life the deep bond between soldier and dog. "But Michael's story isn't unique," she continued. "Right now, there are thousands of soldiers out there struggling to readjust to civilian life. Many of them have canine partners who have been by their side through the worst of times. These dogs aren't just pets, they're lifelines, bridges back to a world that can often feel foreign and overwhelming." Sarah outlined their plans, a program to help veterans adopt their service dogs after retirement, support groups for soldiers and their canine companions, education initiatives to help communities understand the importance of these relationships. As she concluded her speech, Sarah felt a hand on her arm. She looked down to see Billy, his tail wagging gently, his eyes fixed on her face. In that moment, it was as if she could feel Michael's presence, his approval radiating through Billy's steady gaze. The response was overwhelming. People crowded around after the presentation, offering support, sharing their own stories, asking how they could help. Tom's veteran buddies turned up in force, many of them visibly moved by Sarah's words. One man, a grizzled veteran named Frank, approached Sarah with tears in his eyes. He said, his voice gruff with emotion, "I lost my service dog 2 years ago. Hardest thing I've ever been through, harder than the war itself. What you're doing here, it's important. It matters." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by a core group of volunteers, all eager to help turn her vision into reality. They spent hours brainstorming, assigning tasks, and making plans for future events. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's life became a whirlwind of activity. She coordinated with local shelters to identify suitable dogs for training. Tom and his friends set up a mentorship program, pairing experienced handlers with new recruits. The local community college offered space for training sessions and support group meetings. Through it all, Billy remained a constant presence, a living symbol of the bond they were working to honor and support. Sarah noticed that he seemed more energetic, more engaged, as if he too had found a new purpose. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch reviewing the day's progress, Billy laid his head on her lap. She stroked his fur, marveling at how far they had come. "You know, boy," she said softly, "I think Michael would be proud of us. We're not just keeping his memory alive, we're building something that could help so many people." Billy's tail thumped against the porch boards, a sound that now filled Sarah with hope rather than sadness. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The pain of losing Michael would never fully disappear, but it had been transformed into something powerful, something meaningful. Through this project, through the lives they would touch, Michael's spirit would live on. Sarah looked down at Billy, scratching behind his ears in that way he loved. "Ready for tomorrow, partner?" she asked. Billy's response was a soft woof and a gentle lick to her hand. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, They would continue this mission for Michael, for themselves, and for all the soldiers and dogs who had forged unbreakable bonds in the crucible of war. As night fell, Sarah and Billy made their way back inside. The house, once filled with emptiness and grief, now buzzed with purpose and possibility. On the kitchen table lay brochures for their newly named organization, Bonds of Valor, honoring the connection between soldiers and their canine companions. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new challenges, and new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, as Sarah settled into bed with Billy curled up beside her, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. They were on the right path, guided by Michael's memory and the enduring power of the bond between human and dog. In the quiet of the night, Sarah whispered a silent thanks to Michael, to Billy, and to all the brave souls, both human and canine, who had inspired this journey. Their mission was just beginning, but already it had brought healing and hope to so many. And that, Sarah knew, was the greatest tribute she could offer to her son's memory. The warm California sun beat down on Sarah as she stood in the bustling farmer's market, surrounded by the vibrant colors of fresh produce and the chatter of weekend shoppers. But it wasn't the local organic kale or artisanal bread that was drawing attention today. Instead, all eyes were on Billy, sitting calmly at Sarah's side, a bright vest proclaiming him as a Bonds of Valor ambassador. So he was actually in Afghanistan, a young woman asked, kneeling to pet Billy, who accepted the attention with dignified grace. Sarah nodded, a proud smile on her face. 3 tours. He saved countless lives, including my son's. Now he's helping save lives in a different way. As Sarah launched into her well-practiced spiel about Bonds of Valor, she marveled at how far they'd come in just 18 months. What had started as a small, local initiative had blossomed into a nationwide movement. Veterans and their service dogs were coming out of the woodwork, eager to share their stories and lend their support. Among the crowd gathered around their booth was Jake Thompson, a local filmmaker who had been following their progress for months. His camera was never far from his hand, capturing the interactions between Billy and the marketgoers, the way Sarah's eyes lit up as she talked about their mission. "Sarah," Jake called out as the crowd thinned, "I think we've got something really special here. Have you ever considered turning this into a documentary?" The idea took Sarah by surprise. She had been so focused on the day-to-day operations of Bonds of Valor that she hadn't really thought about the bigger picture. "A documentary? I don't know, Jake. We're not exactly Hollywood material." Jake's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "But that's exactly why it would work. This is a real, grassroots movement. It's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Think about it. You could reach so many more people, raise awareness on a national level." As they packed up the booth at the end of the day, Sarah couldn't shake Jake's words from her mind. She looked down at Billy, who gazed back at her with those soulful eyes that seemed to understand everything. "What do you think, boy? Ready for your close-up?" Over the next few months, Sarah's life became a whirlwind of activity. Jake and his small crew became a constant presence, filming everything from support group meetings to training sessions with new dogs. At first, it was awkward having cameras around all the time, but soon it became second nature. The real challenge came when Jake suggested they travel to other parts of the country, to showcase the impact Bonds of Valor was having beyond their small town. It meant time away from home, from the routines they'd established. But as Sarah packed her bags, Billy watching curiously from his bed, she knew it was the right move. Their first stop was a small town in Texas, where they met John, a former Marine who had been struggling with PTSD until he was paired with his service dog, Maximum. As the cameras rolled, John spoke candidly about his experiences. "Before Max, I couldn't even go to the grocery store without having a panic attack," John said, his hand resting on Max's head. "Now, we go for runs in the park. I'm coaching my kids' little league team. It's like I got my life back." Sarah watched from behind the camera, tears in her eyes. This was why they were doing this. This was Michael's legacy in action. Their journey took them from coast to coast. In New York, they filmed a group of veterans and their dogs participating in a parade, the crowds cheering as they marched past. In Seattle, they visited a VA hospital where Bonds of Valor had helped implement a therapy dog program. Everywhere they went, they found stories of hope, of healing, of unbreakable bonds between soldiers and their canine companions. Through it all, Billy remained a steadfast presence, his calm demeanor a balm for the veterans they met. Many of them would kneel down to greet him, seeing in his eyes a reflection of their own experiences. "You know," one veteran said, scratching Billy behind the ears, "it's like he understands. Like he's been there too." As the months of filming stretched on, Sarah found herself opening up more and more on camera. She shared stories about Michael, about the dark days after his death, about how Billy had been her lifeline. It was painful at times, but also cathartic. She felt like she was finally giving voice to everything she and Billy had been through. The day Jake showed her the rough cut of the documentary, Sarah was a bundle of nerves. She sat in the darkened room, Billy at her feet, as the opening scenes played out on the screen. There was Michael's photo, his smile frozen in time. There was Billy, younger and more energetic, in his military working dog gear. And there was Sarah herself, looking lost and broken in those early days after the funeral. But as the film progressed, Sarah saw the transformation. She watched herself grow stronger, more determined. She saw the spark return to Billy's eyes as they found their new purpose. And she saw the impact they were having on veterans across the country. When the lights came up, Sarah was speechless. Jake looked at her anxiously. "Well, what do you think?" Sarah took a deep breath, wiping away tears. It's perfect, Jake. It's everything we've been working for." The documentary, titled Brothers in Arms, The Unbreakable Bond, premiered at a small film festival in Austin. Sarah stood nervously in the wings, Billy by her side, as the theater filled up. To her surprise, she recognized many faces in the crowd, veterans they had met on their journey, supporters who had been with them from the beginning. As the credits rolled, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Sarah was overwhelmed by the response, by the realization that their story, Michael's story, was touching so many lives. In the weeks that followed, things moved at a dizzying pace. The documentary gained traction, picked up by a major streaming service. Suddenly, Bonds of Valor was in the national spotlight. Sarah found herself doing interviews, speaking at conferences, meeting with politicians interested in supporting their cause. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah received a call that left her stunned. The White House was interested in hosting an event to honor the work of Bonds of Valor. As she hung up the phone, Sarah looked at Billy, who wagged his tail as if he understood the magnitude of the moment. "Can you believe it, boy?" she said softly. "We're going to Washington." The day of the White House event dawned bright and clear. Sarah stood on the lawn, surrounded by veterans and their service dogs, Billy a steady presence at her side. As she listened to the president speak about the importance of supporting our veterans, about the healing power of the human-animal bond, Sarah felt a sense of awe wash over her. This was so much bigger than she had ever imagined. What had started as a way to honor Michael's memory had grown into a movement that was changing lives across the country. As the event drew to a close, a young soldier approached Sarah, his service dog at his heel. He said, his voice thick with emotion, "I just wanted to thank you. Your son's story, it saved my life. It made me realize I wasn't alone." Sarah reached out, squeezing the young man's hand. "Thank you," she said softly. "Michael would be so proud to know that his legacy is helping people like you." Later that night, back in their hotel room, Sarah sat on the bed, Billy's head in her lap. She thought about how far they had come, about all the lives they had touched. She thought about Michael, about how his story was now inspiring others to find hope and healing. "We did it, boy," she whispered, scratching behind Billy's ears. "We turned our story into a legacy." As Sarah drifted off to sleep, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The pain of losing Michael would always be there, but it had been transformed into something beautiful, something meaningful. Through Bonds of Valor, through the documentary, through every life they touched, Michael's spirit lived on. And as the nation slept, countless veterans and their loyal canine companions found comfort in each other's presence, their unbreakable bonds a testament to the enduring power of love, loyalty, and the human-animal connection. Sarah and Billy's mission had become a movement, a legacy that would continue to bring hope and healing for years to come. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Sarah made her way down the familiar path in Oak Hill Cemetery. Her steps were slower now, her hair grayed by the passing years, but her eyes still held the same determination they had when she first embarked on her mission over a decade ago. At her side, a young Belgian Malinois named Scout walked with the alert posture characteristic of his breed. As they approached Michael's grave, Sarah's heart swelled with a mixture of sorrow and pride. The simple headstone had been joined by a small plaque, added a few years back, that read, "In memory of Michael Hayes and his faithful companion Billy." Their bond inspired a movement that continues to change lives. Sarah knelt down, her fingers tracing the cool marble. "We did it, Michael," she whispered. "We really did it." Scout sat patiently beside her, his ears perked as if listening for Sarah's soft words. Though he wasn't Billy, he carried on the legacy in his own way. Billy had passed peacefully in his sleep 5 years ago, and Sarah had buried him next to Michael, unable to bear the thought of them apart. Scout was one of Billy's grandpups, bred from a line of service dogs that had started with some of the first canines in the Bonds of Valor program. As Sarah stood, brushing off her knees, she heard the crunch of leaves behind her. Turning, she saw a young woman approaching, a German shepherd at her side. "Mrs. Hayes," the woman called out tentatively. "I'm sorry to bother you, but are you the Sarah Hayes from Bonds of Valor?" Sarah smiled warmly. "That's me. And who might you be?" The woman stepped closer, her hand resting on her dog's head. "I'm Emily. Emily Ramirez. This is Maximum. We're graduates of your program." Sarah's eyes lit up. Even after all these years, meeting the people whose lives had been touched by Bonds of Valor never failed to move her. "It's wonderful to meet you both. What brings you here today?" Emily's eyes flickered to Michael's grave. "I wanted to pay my respects. Your son, his story, it changed my life." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I was in a dark place when I got back from my last tour. Didn't think I'd ever feel normal again. Then I saw that documentary, Brothers in Arms. It gave me hope. Made me reach out to your organization." As Emily shared her story, Sarah listened intently, her heart full. This was Michael's true legacy, not just the organization they had built, but the countless lives touched, the hope rekindled, the bonds forged between soldiers and their loyal companions. They walked together back to the cemetery entrance, Emily and Max falling into step beside Sarah and Scout. "So, what's next for you?" Sarah asked. Emily's face broke into a proud smile. "Actually, I'm starting training next week to become a handler coach for Bonds of Valor. I want to give back, you know? Help other vets the way I was helped." Sarah reached out, squeezing Emily's hand. "Michael would be so proud. This is exactly what we hoped for, that it wouldn't just be about us helping others, but creating a community where everyone supports each other." As they parted ways, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, she was getting older. Yes, there were days when the weight of her memories and the magnitude of their mission felt overwhelming. But moments like this, encounters with people like Emily, reminded her of why they had started this journey in the first place. Back at home, Sarah settled into her favorite armchair, Scout curling up at her feet. The walls of her living room told the story of Bonds of Valor's growth over the years. Photos of veterans and their dogs, letters of thanks, news clippings, a tapestry of lives changed and hope restored. Her eyes fell on a framed photo of Michael and Billy, taken just before Michael's last deployment. Their eyes shone with the same mixture of determination and kindness, man and dog united in purpose. Next to it stood a more recent photo, Sarah at the opening of the Michael Hayes Veteran Support Center in downtown Austin, a state-of-the-art facility that served as both the headquarters for Bonds of Valor and a community hub for veterans and their families. The center had been a dream years in the making. It offered everything from training facilities for new service dogs to counseling services, job placement assistance, and a warm, welcoming space where veterans could gather, share stories, and find support. It was a physical manifestation of the community they had built, a testament to how far they had come from those first small gatherings in Sarah's living room. As the evening light faded, Sarah reached for her laptop. It was time for her weekly video call with the Bonds of Valor team leaders across the country. What had once been a small, local initiative now had chapters in every state, each adapting the core mission to meet the unique needs of their communities. The faces that popped up on her screen were a diverse group, young and old, men and women of all backgrounds, some with their service dogs visible beside them. Each of them had their own story, their own connection to the mission. Some were veterans themselves, others family members of service members, all united by their commitment to supporting the unbreakable bond between soldiers and their canine companions. "Evening, everyone," Sarah began, her voice warm. "Before we get started with updates, I want to share a story from today." As Sarah recounted her encounter with Emily, she saw nods of recognition and smiles of encouragement from the team. This was why they did what they did. This was the heart of Bonds of Valor. The meeting progressed, filled with updates on new initiatives, challenges faced, and successes celebrated. There was talk of expanding their programs to include more support for families of veterans, of partnering with local schools for education programs, of a new research study on the long-term benefits of service dogs for PTSD recovery. As the call wound down, one of the younger team members, a former Marine named Derek, spoke up. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how do you keep going? After all these years, all the stories you've heard, both heartbreaking and inspiring, how do you maintain that passion?" Sarah paused, considering the question. Scout, sensing her thoughtfulness, placed his head on her lap. She absently stroked his ears as she formulated her response. "You know, Derek, it's a good question. There are days when it feels overwhelming, when the weight of all we're trying to accomplish seems too much. But then I think of Michael. I think of Billy. I think of all the Michaels and Billys out there, all the soldiers and dogs who've formed these incredible bonds in the crucible of war and its aftermath." She took a deep breath, her voice growing stronger. "Every time I meet a veteran whose life has been changed by one of our dogs, every time I see a service dog alerting their handler to an oncoming anxiety attack, every time I hear about a soldier who found the strength to keep going because of their canine partner, that's what keeps me going. We're not just saving lives here. We're honoring the sacrifices made by so many, and we're proving that even in the darkest times, there's hope. There's always hope." The faces on the screen nodded solemnly, some wiping away tears. Sarah's words had resonated deeply, reminding them all of the importance of their mission. As the call ended and Sarah closed her laptop, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. Yes, there was always more work to be done. The need was endless, the challenges often daunting. But they were making a difference, one veteran, one dog, one bond at a time. She looked down at Scout, his brown eyes gazing up at her with unwavering loyalty. "What do you say, boy? Ready for another day tomorrow?" Scout's tail thumped against the floor, his whole body seeming to radiate enthusiasm. Sarah chuckled, giving him an affectionate pat. "That's what I thought. We've got work to do, legacies to build." As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah's thoughts drifted to Michael and Billy. Though gone, they were still very much present in every aspect of her life, in every life touched by Bonds of Valor. Their story had become a legacy, a beacon of hope for countless others. And as Sarah drifted off to sleep, Scout keeping watch from his bed nearby, she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories, new opportunities to honor the unbreakable bond between soldiers and their loyal companions. The legacy of Michael and Billy lived on, growing stronger with each passing day, a testament to the enduring power of love, loyalty, and the human-animal connection.